Good afternoon. Welcome to our closing free workshop for the Berea Book Fest. The program we're having tonight is Writing from Life, From Personal to the Persona. Our speaker today is Hannah Pittard. She is a professor at English at the University of Kentucky, where she directs the MFA program in creative writing. Her work has appeared in the Sewanee Review, the New York Times, and other publications and anthologies. She's the author of 4 novels, including Listen to Me and The Fates Will Find Their Way. Visible Empire, her latest novel, will be released in June 2018. Please give a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you, John. Is this okay? Awesome. Thank you guys for being here. This is a really lovely event. It has been a nice way to spend the day. And it's also sunny, so everyone's in a good mood finally. So workshop is a little bit of a misnomer, and I talked to Joyce about this before I came, and she said, yes, but that's the word we use. And I said, okay, but you've asked me to give a reading and a talk. And she said, yeah, but we're going to call it a workshop. But I like how intimate this space is, and my favorite thing is talking to people about writing, and so I'm happy to talk at you a little bit, but if you have questions along the way or if you have a comment, that's fun too for me. So what I thought I would do when Joyce and I were brainstorming about this topic, there are 2 things that I tell my students at the start of every class, and I do it to confuse them and to upset them and to make them think. And so I tell them, tell the truth. You're here to write fiction. Tell the truth. And this usually gets them scratching their heads because how can you tell the truth and write fiction at the same time? And then I also tell them, but make it up. You know, don't ever come to class and say, but this happened after you've handed in a story. Never tell me that this happened, because usually if we're not convinced by something, it doesn't matter that it's happened. We're not convinced. And often the reason we're not convinced is because you're trying to be too accurate. You're trying to be too faithful to something real that's happened, instead of trying to see the truth in it, you know, the heartache in it, the shame in it, and then translate that to fiction. And so what I want to do, I think, my best and most convincing to my students when I am the most vulnerable and I'm the most honest. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about the 3rd book that came out, Listen to Me. It came out in 2016. It is about a couple, childless by choice. We call them DINKs, double income, no kids. Childless by choice, who are on their annual drive from Chicago to Charlottesville. They have a dog. They're in their early 40s. They live a very comfortable life. And they make this drive from Chicago to Charlottesville that they've been making, you know, for the last 10 years of their marriage. It's something they do every summer, but this is the summer when they get a late start. This is the summer when their marriage is in crisis, and this is the summer when things go really, really wrong on the drive. And so that's just the setup to this book. And then what I'm going to do now is just read a little bit from an essay that I wrote after I wrote this book. And I've never read this aloud to anyone, this essay, and I've also never read it. I've never really talked about it with people in Kentucky. So this is, you'll see why I'm picking this to read. In 2014, my husband and I moved from Chicago to Kentucky for matching tenure-track jobs at the same university, in the same field, in the same department. It was the type of opportunity we had long hoped to secure by our early 50s, maybe our late 40s if we were fortunate. Instead, we were still solidly in our 30s when we landed the gig. By the way, this reads like fiction because people don't get this job. Like, this is insane, but this is the real part. Instead, we were still solidly in our 30s when we landed the gig, and our writer friends from all over, LA, New York, Chicago, wouldn't stop telling us how lucky we were and how jealous they were of our good fortune. Our days of struggling to find adjunct jobs to stay afloat were over. We would both be teaching 2 classes per semester instead of the 3-3-3 schedule we'd endured at our school in Chicago. Professionally speaking, we were made. This isn't to say we were unhappy in Chicago. Quite the opposite. Those were the halcyon years of our marriage. But we were tired of being broke and tired of fighting about money. So in 2013, side note, I love to interrupt myself, by the way. We were, when I say broke and fighting about money, we had $50,000 worth of credit card debt. My second book is about that. I wanted to write my first book, everyone said, was so dark. It's about a girl who goes missing and these young men who sort of obsess about her for 40 years and they never embrace their own lives. And I went around and did this big tour, and the thing that people would tell me when I was on tour, they would say, "You're so funny and you're so happy and you smile all the time. Why don't you write a book that reflects that?" And so I wanted to write a comedy. So my second book, which is called Reunion, I sat down to write a funny book. It's about suicide, adultery, and debt. It's really funny. It's actually very funny. We'll talk about that later if we want to. And so somehow I'm dashing and interrupting myself. And about the money, yes. So we were broke and we were fighting about money, and we got these jobs, and we finally were going to pay off that debt, which we did, and we got to eat and not have to. We had other things to fight about, it turned out, but this was a really big opportunity, getting these jobs. But we were tired of being broke and tired of fighting about money. So in 2013, we decided that I, with 1 book published and a second in the pipeline, would go on the academic market. By the time the right offer came the following February, we were ready for a change. We both agreed it would be an adventure, so we moved to Kentucky, even bought a house. Our dog, for the first time in his life, had a fenced backyard to himself. But my husband didn't take to Kentucky living. While we both missed the same things about Chicago, the bars, the food, the constant noise, the busy sidewalks, our friends, he seemed to take Lexington's limited offerings personally, just as Mark, the male protagonist of Listen to Me, interprets his wife's slow recovery from assault, not as an inability to heal, but rather as a refusal of his love. Instead of focusing on what we had, my husband obsessed about the things that we were missing. It was this split in perspective that began to push us apart, just as it does my novel's characters. In Kentucky, this is why it's funny that I'm reading it in Kentucky. Also, you should know, I'm a Kentucky booster. I've only been here 4 years. I love it. In Kentucky, my husband began most mornings with a list of disappointments. There's nothing to look at when we take a walk. The food sucks. These sidewalks aren't even made for walking. There's not a single bartender who knows how to make a real drink. He took my dislike for these lists as a form of rejection. When I asked him to be more positive, he'd respond, "You don't want me to be myself. You want me to bottle up my feelings." When this ritual grew tiresome, I came up with ways to dodge it. In Listen to Me, Mark is able to tolerate approximately 9 months of his wife's PTSD before entering into a flirtation with a much younger woman. My method of avoidance was exercise. I started running daily, usually hitting the pavement at the crack of dawn. If I made it home before my husband was awake, which was more and more my hope, I'd shower, walk the dog, then leave for campus to write for a few hours. He could have his unpleasant morning thoughts without me. The more I settled into my new routine, the more prodigious my output. I finished writing Listen to Me and then wrote the proposal for my 4th novel. Meanwhile, my husband, also a writer, had yet to secure a book deal of his own. In retrospect, it seems obvious and inevitable that the healthier my habits, the happier my work, the more sullen and pessimistic my husband's mood became. "You're never home," he said to me more than once. "You don't talk to me about anything anymore." "I'm home every day by 4, I replied. "We cook dinner together every night." Or, "You're different," he'd say. "You don't stay up late with me like you used to." "I'm 37, I'd say. "I get tired. I want to read in bed. I have to get up early to write." "I'm a writer too," he'd say. "It's not a competition," I'd say. "Then don't make it feel like it is," he'd say. Or, "Everything is always about you," he'd say. "No," I'd say wearily, "everything is always about you." Somewhere in all this, either we started talking like my characters or they'd been modeled after us all along. Take this scene when Mark and Maggie are driving. It's late at night and they still have hours of traveling ahead of them. Okay, so now this is the fiction. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading," she said. She waved her phone at him, so they're in a car and he's driving. "What about?" "Do you really want to know?" "It's hard to concentrate with you over there reading," he said. "Does the light bother you?" she asked. The light didn't bother him. There was hardly any light at all coming from her little device. She turned the screen glow down. She was considerate like that. "Fine," he said. "Sure, hit me. Read me something." Maggie turned off the radio. "Okay," she said. A group of teenagers. So I learned early when something is sad, I'm the youngest child, so when I get beaten up by my brother and sister, I learn to laugh instead of cry. So I often smile at inappropriate moments. Also, this is so macabre and dark that it's making me laugh, because Maggie is really excited to read something like this. "Okay," she said. "A group of teenagers, high school students, kidnap a college kid and torture him to death." "No," Mark said, "not that. Try again." "Burglaries are up on the north side," Maggie said. "Want to hear about that?" "Go for it," Mark said. "And sexual assaults." "I'm good," he said. "Thanks. No more articles for me, okay?" He patted her thigh. "Can you find me a new channel? Anything other than country?" "Do you just want silence?" she asked. "No," he said. "I want to hear something." He didn't like the idea of sitting there listening to her read to herself. Maggie put her phone down and attended to the radio. She flipped through a few stations. "Wait," he said. "Go back." She went back. "Stop," he said. "There." "This?" she asked. A man was talking. He had the telltale conviction of an evangelist. "Yes," he said. "Perfect." "You're actually interested in listening to this man?" she said. On the radio, the voice was explaining away dinosaurs and fossilization with Noah's flood. "You don't think it's fascinating?" he asked. "Fine," Maggie said. "You win." "Win nothing," he said. "It's not a competition." But lately, and this was the unhappy, undesired state of their current condition, it was a competition. The essay goes on and it talks about how I started at one point when I was looking for material for my book. I'd come in and I'd start fights with my husband in order to find dialogue for my couple. And my editor would be reading and she'd say, "Man, you're just like, your dialogue's great these days." But I want to also talk a little bit about, so I started by saying, I tell my students, tell the truth, but make it up. Right? Don't be so wedded to what actually happened that you forget to tell the story, and you forget to make it art. So the last chapter that I wrote for this book, for Listen to Me, it's actually the second chapter in the book. And I got through all the edits, and my editor said, the thing is, these people don't have kids. They have a dog. We care a lot about the dog. But we don't care that this couple isn't going to stay together. You need to give us a reason to root for them. And of course, my editor should have been my therapist, right? I mean, I'm writing about my own marriage that is disintegrating, and she says, these people shouldn't be together. We need a backstory. Convince us that they love each other. So I had to sit down and give them a backstory and a reason for the readers to root for them, because as I was writing them, I think I was capturing this animosity that existed in life so well, that my readers were thinking, my editor was thinking, these people would be better off apart. And so I wrote this second chapter, and I think it's funny and interesting to look at, because there's some in it that's true and there's some in it that's not true. But I'm gonna talk about that in a second. So, chapter 2. Trying to give them a happy backstory. The first chapter is from Maggie's perspective. It goes back and forth from chapter to chapter. So the second chapter is Mark's perspective. And they've been fighting. They're in the car. Things are already bad. Chapter 1, not good. This is not going to be a good road trip. But this is chapter 2. Things hadn't always been this way between Mark and Maggie. A decade ago, when they were still in D.C., still finishing up with grad school, they'd been the envy of their friends. They were never anything so drab as picture perfect. There were fights, certainly, and disappointments. But they'd found in each other a wave, a vibe, a shared view of their interconnection with the universe. It was early autumn when they met, at a party hosted by Georgetown's history department and held, of all places, on a Potomac riverboat cruise. Mark had only agreed to attend because he knew the boat would remain docked. He could leave whenever he wanted. 6 years into his graduate program, he was listless. In the company of other academics, he found himself bored by their inanities and the way they tended to speak more than listen. His plan that night had been to stay only for a beer or two, maybe a shake of hands with the incoming grad students, enough to show he wasn't aloof, then head off to the Tabard Inn, where he would have a late dinner and continue a recent flirtation with a bartender from Poland. She couldn't mix a drink, but she could pour gin over ice, and she spoke with an accent that had caused Mark more than once to clutch his chest in a sweet agony and say, "Hand to God, your voice hurts me to my heart." Georgetown hadn't secured the entirety of the boat. Already budgets were tightening, and so a second party was also being hosted that night by a different school, which was how it happened that Mark caught Maggie's eye. Complete serendipity. She was in her final year of veterinary program at Howard University. She was remarkably tall, and that night, dressed in a sort of Annie Hall getup that was several decades too late. But what initially attracted Mark to Maggie, what caused him to introduce himself in the first place, was an off-kilter gap between her two front teeth, which she exposed, seemingly without embarrassment, whenever she laughed. He assumed she'd been raised either in extreme poverty or extreme wealth. What he liked best about getting together with Maggie those first few months of dating was the way she would, in public or private, seek out direct eye contact. At parties, at dinner, stretching in the park after a run together, he would sometimes find her watching him, which in turn would lead to him watching her, and the two of them might continue to watch each other, no words spoken at all. There was something animal about Maggie, and it made Mark feel there was something animal about him, a sensation he'd never known before to crave. She was as different could be from his cohort at school. So it goes on, and there's some more stuff about like how sweet it is. This is the only thing I made up in the book. This, or even differently said, these were about different people, like different relationships is where I had to draw from in order to find the backstory necessary for this couple. And what's funny about that is that obviously there is backstory that's very loving between me and my now ex-husband, but I couldn't use that real backstory for this couple. I had to draw on a different relationship. And part of that was because I was still too close to a real marriage disintegrating. And so I couldn't think of my ex-husband in those real loving ways that I now, 2 years past the divorce, I can remember it, and it's very, I have wistful feelings. I'm happier than I've ever been, but now I can see what was good. But at the time I couldn't, so I had to look at other relationships that I had enough distance from. And then I'm gonna, just one other thing I want to talk about, and then let's us talk. But there's something that I stole from my real life, and I don't even need to read it. I'll just talk to you about it. It's a good example. I use it when I'm talking to my students. So my ex-husband, before I'd sold my first book even, and before we were married, I think he was having his first bout with depression, and we didn't really understand that it was depression, but I was waiting tables 40 hours a week, and I was writing all the time just for that first book deal and to get my first novel finished. And I would starch my shirt at 3:00, and I'd put on my tie. I worked at a steakhouse, put on my black apron, drive an hour into work, leave at 3:00, get into work at 4, and I'd wait tables until 10 or 11, and then I'd drive back to the farm that I lived on. And when I left at 4, my husband would be wearing this robe. And when I'd get home at 10, he'd be wearing the same robe, and he'd be in the same pajamas. And I knew that this image of a man in a robe was worth something in fiction. And when I was writing this book, I realized that Mark, so Maggie is the wife, and she's been mugged at gunpoint and knocked out, and she has this really difficult recovery. And so, Mark is really patient and wonderful with her for about 9 months. And after about 9 months, everyone deals with grief and grief of others differently. His patience runs out. And I realized finally, as I was writing this book, a perfect way to put that robe into fiction. And it's when Mark is driving home from work and it's during the day. They live in Chicago, so it's not, where you don't have driveways that are, hundreds of yards long and privacy. This is a busy place that they live. And Mark is parallel parking the car. And it's been a long day at work. And he looks across the street and he sees this woman wearing a robe. And it's the middle of the day and she's walking a dog. And he realizes it's his wife. And he realizes right then that he's married to a loser. And that's how he thinks of it. I'm married to a loser. And from there, things just have to sort of go downhill for them. And so I talk about that to say, look, I've taken this one detail, my man, in a robe, clearly a symbol of depression. And I've translated it into fiction by giving it to a woman, changing that it's in the middle of the day, changing the circumstance. But I'm taking this very particular thing and it's representing depression, and I'm giving it to a character and to fiction. I do think when I let my agent read that book, she told me, it happens very early on in the book, she said, I read that line, I'm married to a loser, and I thought, everyone's going to relate to this. And I was like, oh no. But I'd love to either entertain questions or talk to you guys about your work or what you guys are writing on. Yeah.
You had said that whenever you were writing this book, you had to reflect for your second chapter. You had to draw from other relationships because you were unable to see the good times that you had had. Now, having been out of that relationship for a while, if you had the opportunity to go back and pull from your own, would you do so?
That's a great question. No, because even though I was able to write an essay about this book and I'm able to see how much I put into this book that was very, very personal, I also think of them as Mark and Maggie. It's crazy Mark and crazy Maggie. And so I wouldn't change it. And I also, this book is one of the shortest books that I've ever written. It took me the longest of any books that I've ever written. And I really think that in Listen to Me, there's not a word out of place. I think every book could be better, I'm sure, but this book is actually exactly what I want it to be. And there are things that I would probably change about every other book, including the book that's coming out in June, that they're beyond my control now. But this book, yeah, I wouldn't change anything. That's a great question.
I was just curious, when you used the robe in the novel, was it literally the same robe, color, pattern, etc.? I mean,
yeah.
Did you import the image?
I did, and I even incorporated it the same way that I remembered encountering the robe that my ex-husband wore when Maggie's walking down the street and Mark sees her. He doesn't know where the robe has come from. Like, it's just appeared. I mean, not only does he see her outside, but this is a robe he's never seen before, and it's a plaid LL Bean robe. And this is very confusing to him. And he even says the way that they first talked about the robe, he went home, he sees her, they go in together, and the way that he thinks that they're joking about the robe, like he makes a joke and he thinks it's something to joke about. And then he's having these realizations as her, depression sort of continues and the PTSD continues, that maybe he was the only one joking, that it was never a joke to her. And, I encountered the robe very much the same way. The very first time that I saw the robe, I'd gotten home from work and, it's 10 o'clock, so it's fine. 10 o'clock at night, everyone should have their pajamas on. I have my pajamas on, 4 o'clock now, especially on a weekend. But I walked in and my husband has his pajamas on and a robe. And I've never seen him in a robe before. And I joked with him and he joked. We kind of showed it off. Like, and I'm thinking, where did this thing come from? It's not new, you know, it's worn. And then it became something that I went to work the next morning, and he's got the robe on still, and I came home and I made the robe again. And the robe again. And then it wasn't funny. You know, it was funny, and then it wasn't. Then it represented something very real, and we went from being able to laugh about it to not being able to talk about it at all. And I think that's often how problems grow in relationships, when they stopped being talked about and they go untreated. Did you have a question?
I did. For that chapter 2 section, when you drew from other people's experiences, I assume they were people you actually knew, or stories that...
By other people's experiences, I mean my experiences with other men.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
that's the next question.
There was this guy that we never dated, but I met him in Russia, and he just had the most amazing direct eye contact, and made me feel I was 26, and I'd been dating the same boy for 6 years. This boy who famously once said to me, when I asked him if he thought I was smart, I said, "Do you think I'm smart?" We'd been getting in so many fights, and I realized that he was treating me like somebody who he didn't think was very intelligent. So one day I said, do you think I'm smart? And he said that he couldn't tell whether or not I was smart because he couldn't gauge the intelligence of women. This was in the first year of our relationship, and I stayed with him for 5 more years. So, right. So I'm in that relationship. I went to Russia for a writing seminar, which was absolutely wonderful, where I met this young man who was capable of this great eye contact. And of course, I believe in fidelity, and I wouldn't have known how to cheat on someone anyway, and I never would have, but I fell so hard for this. I mean, it made my heart hurt. And I think everyone probably has some sort of animal connection with another person at some time in their life, but nothing ever happened, nothing transpired. I don't stay in touch with this person, but it was a strong enough connection that at 26, 27, I went home and I went back to this other man who I lived with and I'd been with for 6 years, and I had been unable to break up with him for 6 years, wanting to. That eye contact was enough to finally let me leave this person. And so that was something that I knew I could rely on to help explain the connection that these two people had. So I was thinking about that. So my own experience, but fictionalized. Yeah.
Did your ex-husband recognize himself?
Yes. Yes, he did. He sure did. So the I can't tell if it would be. I'll read this. What I skipped was the opening part of the essay. This is super short, but this. So last July, which would actually be 2 Julys ago, last July at a reading I was giving in Washington, D.C., a woman raised her hand and asked, "You write so well about trauma, but has anything really terrible ever happened in your own life?" Normally at these events, I'm asked different versions of the same fairly innocuous questions. Where did the idea for your novel come from? How long did it take you to write? When did you realize you were a writer? As far as I can remember, I had never before been asked about my own proximity to trauma or misfortune. Yet, as chance would have it, I had discovered just the morning before that my husband and best friend were having an affair. So this was my book came out, the book that ultimately ended my marriage, the day that I found out that my husband and my best friend were having an affair, and I was on this giant reading. And so I moved from my reading in New York, where I'd made this discovery, and had gotten to DC, where my sister had greeted me at the train station with, and it works, hemorrhoid cream, because to put here, my face was swollen shut. But I got to that reading, and so my family a lot of my family lives in the DC area, and I have a lot of friends in the DC area, and one of my ex-husband's best friends since 2nd grade, who has become a best friend of mine, obviously we were together so long, he and his family live in DC. So all of these people were at the reading, who knew me and who knew what was going on, because obviously my ex-husband had called his best friend, and obviously my family who was in town knew. But then there were, strangers. So it was a packed audience, probably 100 people, 20 of whom knew what was going on. And one of the very first questions is this woman who raises her hand and says, "Has anything really bad happened to you?" And there's footage of this, so it's Politics and Prose. And my best friend from high school she works at this online sort of thing called Vox, and they'd invited her there to interview me for the podcast. And so you can see me, I'm at the front. I am my typical, like, laughing instead of crying. I'm tormented on the inside, but it's one of the funniest interviews I think I've ever given, and I'm laughing the whole time out of nervousness. But this woman asks the question, and there's this pause. I've gone back and watched the video, and there's a pause, and you see me look around the room at the 4 to 20 people who know what's going on, and then I end looking at my husband's best friend, who is also one of my best friends, and I just look at him, and then I look away and I say, my dad died of pancreatic cancer in 2016, and it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and we moved on. But there was a moment where I was really thinking, I'm just going to tell him. I really just thought this is going to be good for all of us, especially me. So listen, last night, tell me how crazy this is. That's what I wanted to do, because I felt that I had 100 people who would be really supportive and loving at that moment, and I kind of needed that. But I also, it's like that eye contact with Ben at this moment was enough to bring me back to reality and say, that's not appropriate. Keep it to yourself. I will say, there was a man so I took the train from New York to DC for that day for the reading. Anytime I can, I avoid airplanes. I hate them. So I took the train down, and I am a mess. I have snot coming out of my ears. I am such a mess. I've just found out about my husband, and now I have to get on a public vehicle and for 4 hours. And there's no assigned seating in trains, and so I'm walking up and down looking for a place to sit, and there's one chair, and it's on the inside next to a window, and in the seat that is occupied, that's on the aisle, there is this really elegantly dressed man in his late 20s, early 30s, so younger than I am, but just really perfectly put together and very clean. And here I am covered in snot. I'm blowing my nose into my shirt, and I have to walk up to him and say, "Excuse me, can I sit there?" So I sit down, and I proceed for the first hour to stay as huddled up next to the window as I can. I'm so embarrassed. I'm just mortified. And every time I get it kind of together and I stop crying, my husband texts me. And he and I are already making jokes about the end of this, the end of our marriage. This is how close we were. We've known each other for 10 years before we even got married. So we were just best friends, and even as he has broken my heart, we're still already cracking jokes. The book is dedicated to Andrew. It says to Andrew, without whom this story wouldn't exist. And so at one point I'm on the train, and I text him, and I'm like, "The book will always be dedicated to you. There's that." And he writes back, and he says, and I'm kind of getting it back together. I'm breathing, I'm not crying, and he writes back and he says, "Wait, is this the book about the dying marriage?" And I just started crying again. This man could not be, in my mind, and this all gets back to fiction and imagining other people and empathy. So this man, in my mind, could not be more disgusted with me if he tried. His body language basically says that I am a leper and that I do not deserve to be in this public space. And I'm mortified, but I'm also angry at how awful he's being. And at one point I look over at him and I say, "I'm not contagious." And he just looks at me like, "Oh, you talked." But then check this out. So we stop in Philly, and you get up, people can get off along the way. We stop in Philly, and he says to me, I couldn't believe that he talked. He turns to me and he says, "It's gonna be okay." And I just wept anew. I just bawling because I was thinking this whole time that he was disgusted with me, and the whole time he was probably sitting there thinking, what could I do or say? You know, obviously he was able to read my texts. I had taken a few calls. He clearly put it together. That moment of humanity was almost more than I could bear. I mean, it was just devastating. And I've spent so many minutes and hours really thinking of that young man. And it's gestures, tiny gestures like that of kindness that make me A, really grateful to be alive, and B, love to write fiction, because I think that reading and writing fiction promotes empathy. It's how we understand what other people are experiencing, or try to understand what other people are experiencing. And that was such a good reminder for me, who I'm a fiction teacher. I was teaching fiction even when this happened, and I loved that moment happened because it was such a good reminder that even I, who am constantly looking, I'm always thinking, especially when people behave badly, I'm always trying to think, but why are they doing this? They must be having a bad day. There's something. Why is my colleague treating me like this? I know that this is not how they are. What's going on at home? What bad news did he just get? Who that he loves has just been diagnosed with something. Has he been diagnosed with something? Surely he has, because he could not possibly be such a jerk. Like, there must be something going on. And whenever always thinking about what somebody else might be going through really keeps me from being fast to anger. And I loved that moment with that man because it was a reminder to be more empathetic and to be more thoughtful, and that even though I think that I don't make assumptions about other people, that I'm really open-minded, even I still do. And I think that there's always something to learn, and there's always a little nugget. The quiet things in life are the ones that I really want to write about and sort of break open. I think I rambled a bit. That's what I'll do. Are there other? Yeah.
So this is kind of building on the robe again, but
sure.
so I'm just.
Everybody likes the robe.
Thinking. So as I'm thinking about what I'm hearing about how you're approaching fiction, what you're drawing from life. So one thing is a kind of psychological understanding, either that comes from your direct experience or something you've perceived or imagined into someone else, so that what are they thinking, or what, sort of psychological. A second is a visual. I mean, that image of the robe itself, as an object was sort of there, that when you needed something, you drew on a strong visual memory. A third is the ear, the dialogue and the fight, etc. So I wondered if, because I write nonfiction chiefly, so I use all those things, but it's always with sort of, yes, I really want to tell the actual, well, so I'm just wondering if you would say a little more about kind of how those things weave together, like what would cause you, or is there one of those modes that is like the really central one, and then the others just sort of happen to come in, or do you ever start from hearing something that then makes you want to move inside, or seeing something?
I would say that overheard dialogue is probably the most, for me, the most inspiring and impactful encounter from the thing that I encounter that is the most inspiring and impactful on my writing life. In the essay, I don't just lambast my husband. I really, really delve into my own shortcomings as a human being to be in a room with. And one of the things that is awful about being my friend, so it must be 20 times worse being my partner, is that because I am always paying attention to other things that are going on, I am rarely paying 100% attention to the person who's sitting across from me, aka my husband. My husband used to say that I was only ever 25% present. I think he was being generous. We would go to a bar and I'd be listening to what the college girls were saying, because I'm so interested in how people interact. And he would be pouring his guts out or complaining about Kentucky or telling me about a basketball game, and he got about the same percentage from me. So that was the shortcoming that I bring to the relationship. And I'm working on that, but the thing is I also really love watching people. I think, for instance, you mentioned, as I was sitting here, that you have a neighbor with 17 cats. Did you say that? It's the best thing I've heard all day. I already wrote it down. And so this is the other thing I do. I write down things like that because, like, I can't make that up. That's great. My neighbor has 17 cats. Sold. I want to read it.
One dog.
This is great. I mean, you guys are doing it right now. And a dog. Somebody came in there today and said, he came up and he said to me and Judy, "Y'all behaving?" And I said, we're trying. And he said, and then he tells me a story. He says, my father used to ask everybody, "You behaving?" He'd call across the street, "You behaving?" I'd say, "Dad, who's that?" He'd say, "I don't know, but how am I supposed to get to know them if I don't ask if they're behaving?" And I'm like, are you giving me this dialogue? Can I have it? Because I wrote it down. And then he said something else. He said, my father had more friends than a barrel of monkeys. And I thought, do barrels of monkeys have lots of friends? I don't know. I mean, I just wanted him to sit down and say some more things. So it is for me. It has always started with what I've heard. I was a terrible child to be in a car with when I was young. My parents would sit in the front, obviously, and I would listen to them talk. And occasionally, I would say, "Mom, will you say that again?" And I realized that she thought I didn't understand her, and so she would rephrase so that I could understand her, and I would get this rage that I couldn't articulate. I'd say, "No, could you repeat precisely what you said and how you said it?" And she'd say, "Oh, I don't know, it was something about," and I'd say, "No, that wasn't it, go back." And by the time I would be able to articulate, "I wanted you to precisely use the language that you used," she would say, "I've forgotten." And it would just drive me crazy. So I write everything down. Ben Percy has a really good essay called Indelible Images, and it's all about using film techniques, translating these film techniques into a writing technique. And he talks about, for instance, Jaws. If I say Jaws, has everyone seen Jaws? Do you have an image in your head when I say Jaws? Yeah, right? Exactly. For me, it's that. Well, for me, it's the Irishman telling this. I think he's Irish. The guy telling the story. There were 100 sharks. 900 men went into the water. Like 20 came out the next day, like that. And it's dark, and that noise, and the knocking, or Jaws at the end with his mouth open. But there are these in the essay he talks about. There are these indelible images. If I say E.T., it's the bike across the moon, right? And so he talks about taking images like that from our own lives, so that if I were to say right now, first job you ever had, does something come to mind, an image? For me, my first job, when somebody says first job, I think of this African violet that I would go in and I would watch it die. It wouldn't water it. I would think every day, at least for a couple minutes every day, I could get up and water this African violet right now, and it would live. Nope. And I'd come in the next day, I could get up and water this. I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. I would throw the African violet away. I would get a new one the next month. It would be the same thing. This is what I think of when I think of my first job. Now, at some point, I will use this African violet. It will not be about a job, but it will be probably about a person who is going through some sort of, I doubt that it would be depression, but like a funk. To me, that would be some sort of image that might represent somebody not being able to get out of a cycle. And so I will use that one day, but I write it down when I remember things like that, when I have memories from my youth. or from my childhood or from adulthood, and if I hear them and I'm fast enough to write down like 17 cats, that gets written down. My dad, whenever he calls, I only answer. He's a lunatic. I love him. He's a lunatic. I only answer when I have a piece of paper and a pen in front of me, because the man is a gift. He is a gift of dialogue. There's this dialogue so this is the book that's coming out. I'm going to see if I can find it really quickly. If I can't, I won't. But there's this monologue that is in this book, and it's like 99.9% what my dad said to me on the phone one day while I was writing this book. I've got this character, his name is Coleman, and Coleman is kind of this ne'er-do-well who inherits a boatload of money when his dad dies. His dad hated him, he hated his dad. I think I'm actually coming up with it. And it's just so perfect for him. I couldn't believe that my father had just like created this character. Almost there. Okay, I found it. This is my dad. I just like updated a couple things. So there are these two men at a bar. One of them has just left his wife and he's feeling really, really sorry for himself. And the other one, his father has just died and he's inherited tons of money and he's an awful guy. So all he's excited about is his money. So Robert, who's just left his wife, says, "What's next?" Coleman says, "Today?" And Robert says, "For life, for all your lousy money, what's next?" This is Coleman's response, aka my father. "I was in the Bahamas last month. There were these 3 other men, salt-of-the-earth types, good, decent, fun-loving, God-fearing types. We rented a boat. We took it out every morning at dawn. We did things that teenagers do. We caught fish. We caught at least a few fish. We lived like kings. These were salt-of-the-earth men. Did I already say that? First-class people. We were pigs is the truth. Gluttons for pleasure. We left on a Wednesday. Tony? You know Tony? Nah, his parents weren't on the plane. He's from South Carolina. They've got money. They don't go wild for art the way, so this is the part I added in about money and art. Hold on. Not the point though. Point is, Tony was getting a catheter the following Monday. He'd be done after that. Permanent catheter, as in until God calls him home catheter. No more boats, no more bonefish, no more Bahamas. Tony's liver is done, his kidneys too, so I went down. It was his last chance, and through the weekend, all 4 of us, we lived like teenage kings. I'll take you sometime. I'll fly you down. I've got my license. And then it goes on. And from there, I make it about travel and flying, and I bring it back into the book. But salt of the earth, catheters, Bahamas, living like teenage kings. We were gluttons for pleasure. We caught fish. I mean, I wish my brain did that, but here's the thing. When I overhear things like that, it's also a technique like to remind me, and I tell my students this as well, you don't have to link things. You listen to the way people move and jump from subject to subject. We can do that too, especially in dialogue. So I love listening. All of my ideas come from listening. Yeah.
In terms of your planning, how you go start a book,
Mm-hmm.
you've been inspired with dialogue and you started. How do you plan out where the book will take you next?
So I started as a short story writer, not a novelist. And what I love about short stories is that they're compact. You know, there's a quick beginning, a quick middle, and a quick end. And as I was writing stories, I always thought of them as, you know, getting to the punchline. The ending, especially if it was sad, I still thought of it as a punchline. And so when I would sit down to write a story, usually with something that I had overheard as a piece of dialogue that I knew had to be in there, even if it wasn't at the start, I didn't know where a story was going. And in fact, my first 3 novels, especially my first novel, I didn't know at all where it was going. I wrote the first 200 pages, absolutely hit a wall, read 2 books. In the middle of the second book that I was reading, I looked up and I said, oh, it's a love story. And of course, my husband, who was at the time wearing the robe, this was in the horse farm stage of our not yet marriage, my husband said, no, it's not. It's not a love story. I love that he would disagree. He hadn't even read it. And I was like, no, it is. And he said, you're writing a story about a girl who's been kidnapped. It's not a love story. And I said, no. and then suddenly I knew where it was going. So reading helps me, but the first and only book I've really ever been able to plot is the newest one, and it involved a wall that was as big as this one and 3x5 cards, and there are 6 characters whose limited point of view we spend time with, and I had their names at the top of the wall like that, and then I had their individual timelines and backstories. Piedmont Dobbs is a 19-year-old who is rejected from integrating one of the first all-white public schools in Atlanta. So I had his timeline first. And Lily is a woman who is 8 months pregnant and her parents die on the plane crash and her husband leaves her. So I have her timeline, and I knew everything that I wanted. I give myself boundaries. This entire story is going to take place in one summer. So for each character, what is this character going to encounter over the course of one summer? And so I tried to be kind to myself in that way and really just look at one character at a time, and I put it all out like that for all 6 characters. And then I had another wall with a giant piece of paper across it, and that's where I had these kind of circles that showed, like a Venn diagram, where things overlapped, and I knew that there were going to be particular moments when these 6 people, their lives and their stories, sort of forever change one another. So that story, though, this story, I knew when I started it, I wanted it to be about a couple that begins at the end. It begins at the end of their relationship, and I knew that by the end of the summer, I wanted them to come back together as completely different people. So I wanted to reunite a husband and a wife, but as their better selves, only after they'd encountered this terrible trauma and gone away from one another and learned to be who they really were, and then come back. So that was at the heart of this story, and then everything else was like weaving it in. It's really difficult, but 3x5 cards helped me, and they help a lot of my students too. And then that way you can sort of separate what you're looking at. You know, a computer, it's all condensed and flat, and I really sometimes just need to be able to see all of the storylines.
Thank you.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Also, if you're not in the mood to write, but you're working on your wall, you feel productive. The downside to the wall technique, it counts. The downside to the wall technique, though, is sometimes you can see the whole story so clearly that you don't want to write it. I mean, there was a day when I took a picture of my wall and I sent it to my editor and I said, can you send someone down here to write this for me? Because I see it so vividly, I don't really feel the need to write it down. And she was like, how about getting paid? And I said, okay. I'll go try a little harder. But I mean, so there are moments when, one reason that I don't want to ever see things too clearly is because I think there's no fun or play. I can't imagine having fun or being playful with it. But yeah, that's a good question. Anything else?
So are you saying that you like to have that space where the characters actually help write the story, right?
I do.
Having it
Yeah.
closed?
I like to be surprised. There is nothing I enjoy more, and I'm sure that all of you in this room have had this moment, if you think of yourself as a writer, and I hope you do, but there's nothing I enjoy more than rereading something that I've written and thinking, when did I come up with that? Or thinking, I wrote that? That's awesome! And I don't know how I did it. That to me is the reason I write, so that I can reread and have those moments of surprise and just think, that was somewhere in me. That's cool. This day was a good day. I guess I'll try it again tomorrow. And tomorrow it might not be that good, but I can always reread this passage. Yeah, that's a good question.
Were you saying that you do the 3x5 cards with each with the character's name on it,
Mm-hmm.
and then underneath it you use 3x5 cards to write
Oh yeah, it's intense.
whole sheets?
Yeah, it's pretty intense. So the names are huge up above, and then there were it's kind of like those writing down over her dialogue, things like that. Some of the 3x5 would be scene in which Piedmont Dobbs is arrested by 2 white racist police officers. And that's all I would put there. And I wouldn't feel the need to write it. It would just be a relief for me to know whenever I'm ready to write that scene, it's there. And there's the reminder that I need to do it. So sometimes I would just be walking and I would think, oh, I've got to, that's such a good idea. I'm going to have Coleman and Robert be in an airplane, and Coleman is going to turn the engine off and they're going to do a nosedive. Great. Then I'm not ready to write that scene, but I cannot forget that I have to put these 2 lunatic men in a tiny prop plane and turn the plane off. So stuff like that, and then some of it would just be a line of dialogue that I might have overheard in real life, and I know that it's something that Piedmont would say, and I just put it under Piedmont. I don't know where it goes, I don't know anything. I heard a man say this, and I think it's, so there's a voice of reason in this book, and it's this man who has lost his wife and his mother-in-law, and it's based on a real man who lost his wife and his mother-in-law. He and his wife never flew on the same plane together. This book is about a real plane crash. He and his wife never flew on the same plane together, and so he was watching his wife and his mother-in-law as they took off, and he saw them die. And then 5 hours later, he had to get on his own plane because his 3 boys were back in Atlanta waiting for him. So he was this, mythical man growing up in Atlanta, this terrible, terrible tragedy. But I'm saying this because, at some point in the last 3 or 4 years, I overheard a man, and I got it right in this, I'm going to remember it incorrectly, but he said something like, I am beating my chest against my hand. And I thought, what an interesting image. Instead of beating my hand against my chest, like the effort of moving like that, I heard it and I realized this has to come from the man who is the voice of reason, that at the end when he's trying to describe his own emotion, what a great way to reverse the image of like somebody doing this, like it's so intense that it's a whole body shoving itself against a hand. And so I wrote that down, and I knew that it belonged to him. I knew that it had to belong to Rafe Bentley, who's the voice of reason. I just didn't know where or how, but it did make it in. And it actually, in fact, I overheard that before I was even working on this book. I mean, it came from, the really extra special things that I overhear that their own, like, tack board, because I find that seeing them gives me pleasure, and it reminds me of these, that people just say the damnedest things. I just love the damn things that people say. If we weren't being recorded, I would tell you some of the amazing things that my mother has been saying recently, but I won't, for fear that she watches it one day, but it'll end up in something, I promise. Yeah.
How would you advise someone that has written a lot of academic writing and wants to shift to some other type of genre that is almost opposite of academic writing?
That's a great question. So part of, I would really honestly say read all of this Ben Percy essay that I've alluded to about indelible images, because one of the things that he says is kind of like an assignment that is given over the course of this essay, and it's something that you can do over the course of a day or even a month. But he says, look for these images that are either memories or things that you're actually seeing, and write them down. Write them down and just put them away. And then once you think you have enough special images, these indelible images, make a constellation of them. Like put them all on one board or on a table. Like little, and by indelible image, it could be an anecdote, right? It could be, I see a college kid get out of a car to help an old man cross the street and then get back in a car, right? Something like that, where you're just like, damn, did I just see that? People are awesome. But then maybe something else where, you see an old man get out of a car and step on a squirrel, and you're thinking, did he do that because the squirrel wasn't quite dead? and he was putting the squirrel out of his misery, or did he do that for his own enjoyment? I don't know yet, but I just saw it happen, and it's really upsetting to me. It's upsetting because I don't know which it was. Put that. And so then when you think you have enough images, put them all together and see where you can connect them, if there are any connections. And I think something creative could come out of that. I mean, a really popular prompt is for young writers, or for new writers, young is the wrong word, but a really popular prompt for new writers is to give them very specific, bizarre parameters. So write me a story in which a mattress falls out of a window, a traffic cop gets into an argument, it rains, and someone loses their job. What I love about that, also, giving this assignment to 150 freshmen, for instance, what I love about this is it dispels the myth that every story has already been told, because it doesn't matter that every story has ever been told, because I assign those 4 details, or those 4 restrictions to 150 people, we get 150 different stories. And it starts with just the ordering of it. And think about how many different stories we just get from, okay, well, what if the mattress falls from the window at the end of the story versus at the beginning? If it happens at the beginning, maybe it's the thing that causes the accident that gets the traffic guard in a fight with somebody because it's also raining, or maybe it's raining and there's a moving company, and because it's raining, the mattress that's coming out the window slides, but maybe the traffic guard has something to do with, so you're also always looking for causality. So what's fun about putting those, your constellation of young unexpected boy walking a man across the street in a gesture of kindness, or maybe he was picking his pocket. I don't know, right? Old, mean-looking man getting out and killing a squirrel, or was he doing something kind? Like, you put all those things together, put them together in several different orders, and see where you can find causality. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, instead of this happened, next this happened. Like, you want to try to link them. Because I came out of the bathroom 5 minutes too early, or because I said I was going to make a phone call and my husband and my best friend thought I would be away for a little bit longer, they did not anticipate me seeing, nor did I anticipate me seeing her hand on his thigh, so that when I got back to the table and I said, "What's going on?" and she said, "Oh, have you felt this denim?" I either have a moment to decide I'm going to believe this lie they've just constructed, or I'm going to get on with the rest of my life. That's not how I discovered it, by the way, I just made that up. But so things like that, the causality of, okay, somebody is delayed by 5 minutes, and so therefore doesn't get to see something that would alter her life, or she's delayed by 5 minutes, and so she does get to see something, but then she chooses not to acknowledge it, but it turns out they really wanted her to acknowledge it, so they kept doing it until she was forced. I think that there's just so much fun you can have, but it really begins with becoming a very bad partner and paying attention to the world and not the person that you're supposed to be in a relationship. I'm kidding, that's a joke. Yeah.
Kind of 2 questions. One, do you ever find yourself needing some distance from personal experiences in order to make it that persona? And then 2, are there some personal experiences that stay personal?
That's a great question, and I'll use this to wrap it up, because I'm sure that you're probably out of tape soon, if not already.
2 minutes left.
Okay, great. So that's a really interesting question about whether some things stay personal. I've already told so many anecdotes today that I think of as very personal. I think that it makes a lot of people nervous who are very close to me, that I am as open as I am with personal things, but I guess the distinction I would say is, often when I'm writing about something that technically happened or occurred in a certain way, I'm then not writing about the people that it happened to. I'm taking that experience and I'm trying to parse it out and understand it. So sadly, I will probably always write about everything. That if I can remember it and if it haunts me, I'm going to write about it. And that does mean that I will probably burn some bridges along the way, but I think most of the people who love me understand that I am doing it from a point of trying to understand the world, and not from I'm never looking down at the world and trying to make fun of something. I'm always looking up at it and trying to understand it. And I promise I won't take the line about the 17 cats unless it's okay. I always get permission if I know the person or I'm in the room long
And her
enough.
dog is the same size as the cats, isn't it?
Probably plays with.
So it's like having 18 cats. Thank you guys so much for it. This was just a lovely day in Berea. I really appreciate it. Yeah. You're all dismissed. Do your homework. Perfectly timed.